Ancient alien gods. Now, this is a topic that I've always been specifically interested in. Being raised as a Christian, I always heard these tales of, angels coming down from heaven. And I'd see people in church with their hands up, feeling this energy of connecting with Christ or their higher power. So I find it fascinating that around the world, there are these stories of a time when man lived amongst their living gods, interacted with their living gods. So in today's lesson, we're going to kind of review some of the world culture's view of these interactions and see if there aren't similarities that we want to take note of. As I mentioned, being raised as a Christian, kind of want to start in some of the things that I was familiar with. And really what I always found fascinating about the biblical information, obviously with the overtone of the ancient astronaut theory, is looking at the fact that there's always a presence of them coming down from the skies. Now, most of the Renaissance artwork that we have coming out of the last, several hundred years, especially around this Renaissance era, all of the biblical information always depicts the beings coming down from heaven. And many references in the Bible, too, depict either beings ascending into heaven or descending into heaven with these types of winged angelic beings, usually with halos of light around them and depicted with wings, as if they have the power of flight. So whether it be, Elijah being taken up by a whirlwind, or Ezekiel seeing what appear to be wheels within wheels, or a chariot of fire in the sky, I don't think ancient man had access or could fully understand and relate to technology that we do today to describe aerial phenomenon and such. Whether we would say it's an airplane, a helicopter, or possibly a nuclear propelled craft like a TR-3B, or even an anti-gravitic device, which I'm sure is in production. So a lot of these things, again, have a biblical or spiritual overtone, but we have to wonder if this isn't just misrepresented technology. All of these scenes that come out of this Renaissance artwork are very visual and kind of trying to portray this biblical, technological connection between heaven and earth. You can see that these two gentlemen appear to be manipulating what appears to be some type of a rod. And as you can see, there's a clear path of them whirling what appears to be into the sky. So a lot of this artwork, I think, has an overtone that is very familiar with the normal Christian views of these bright angelic beings, usually also depicted with wings. Well, it's very interesting to note that a lot of these depictions in the Christian, Judeo-Christian Bible of beings with wings aren't just depicted for Christianity as these higher spiritual beings. In fact, most cultures around the world, even thousands of years predating the Hebrew or Christian Bible, have very similar references and stories to these angelic beings and depict them in the same way. Now, this can't be by coincidence that different cultures around the world, some of them without even having contact to the outside world, have similar stories, similar depictions. And obviously where I was most fascinated in my being raised as a Christian was looking at the fact that these ancient Sumerian texts and ancient depictions of their gods, the Anunnaki, again, resonate exactly with what we hear in the Hebrew and Christian Bible. More specifically, it has more detail. Just like in the Hebrew version, there were many gods. In the Christian version, there's only one God. In our image and after our likeness, there were once giants upon the earth. So as we go back from the Christian Hebrew to the Sumerian versions, not only do the depictions become more interesting, but we see similar references to this understanding of the power of flight. So let's go ahead and look at this as we realize that, this is a depiction that we've seen over and over with reference to biblical information. How we're bequeathed information from higher life forms. They're usually depicted as coming down from the heavens. This is a consistent theme with the ability for them to be above the populace, always above, the gods are always above in the sky. Now that's not to say that there aren't gods in the ground as well, or ancient cultures didn't think that way. There are many different cultures that believed there were underground gods. Indian gods looked at a serpent race called the Nagas that believed lived in underground areas. And there were actually Mayan and Aztec rituals to appease what they believed to be subterranean gods. Again, these serpent gods. We're going to come back to that topic in a minute. It's a very interesting point. But we definitely see a common theme with depictions of these biblical references, Jesus and various other angelic references. They're always coming down from the sky. Now, what we also see in connection with these, heavenly scenes, or again, things depicted in the sky, is usually a reference to some type of technological use of a device. We've seen this over and over in various biblical scenes where, again, ancient man didn't understand what they were seeing and tried their best to represent and depict what they were seeing. Now, to me, this looks like two spiritual beings, obviously clothed in robes and in the clouds, so this represents them being in the sky. But they're manipulating some circular device. You can see that they're holding it as if these are two antennae, kind of like tuning into God, if you will. Now, how would they have been able to represent what if they saw a circular flying craft and either beams of light or men in the craft manipulating levers and gears, or what appeared to be doing some type of tuning with an antenna? They wouldn't understand it. They wouldn't be able to explain it. All they could do is give visual references. So when we analyze a lot of this artwork, we have to understand that back then they didn't understand technology, but we do. And we can look at a lot of these references of what appear to be the power of flight actually being depicted as technological sources of information. Even how we would characterize our own flight characteristics, like a spaceship, and things that we would use now as the top of the rocket departs the capsule and then actually travels in space or returns. A lot of these things have very similar references to our own uses for the power of flight. Now, this is a very infamous scene of the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's shown in this fresco in this large monastery in what was then Yugoslavia. And you can see, again, these references to power of flight. And you can see that the gentleman in here is manipulating. Again, he has his hands positioned. He's doing something. They don't understand, but they clearly saw him manipulating something in the craft. So they did their best to describe it. And again, you can see over in this corner, this one too has similar references. Now, I believe I have some more enlarged shots of this with higher resolution, so we'll just move on to those. But obviously, the crucifixion of Jesus, we have these very interesting scenes where even the beings with the angels, again, the winged beings, are looking and noticing the craft and are holding their hands up as if they're scared of these craft in the sky. And these can't be, again, coincidence. All they can do is depict what they were seeing. This looks like some type of a man flying in a comet. But what we can deduce with science is that anything that's flying within our atmosphere that's a high energy source is going to create a gaseous environment. It's going to create phosphorescence in our atmosphere. Anything that interacts with our gaseous atmosphere is going to instantly create phosphorescence. That's why most of the high energy sources that we see filmed are just a ball of light, because anything that's just a high energy source is going to be depicted that way. And that's exactly what a lot of these depictions show us, what appear to be their observation of exactly what we see today with our own filming equipment. So these are actually pretty accurate representations of what apparently are UFOs, but in ancient times, and being depicted as piloted by other human-like beings. Now, of course, they would think that they were gods. How else could they perceive this without understanding technology? Now, as I referenced earlier, some of the Christian angelic references to these winged beings, we have to give note to the fact that there is many other depictions, even thousands of years before the Christian angel, even 10,000 years when we go back to the Hindu representations of Indian gods and their flying in vimanas and have other similarities to these winged craft or the winged disc that you can see here. Many of the ancient cultures, specifically the oldest one we have on record, Sumer, depict the Anunnaki, which we're of course going to extensively cover in some of these courses. But some of the symbology that we see is very interesting as a reference to the power of flight, whether it be with wings or with this circular disc with wings, the winged disc. Now again, if they see a disc flying in the sky, how else can they explain that this circular object was in the sky or was moving in the sky? They give it the reference of having wings. So to me, this is very clear information. A being with the power of flight in a winged disc or in a craft of some sort with even landing gear depicted. This makes sense when you understand that they didn't understand technological references. They could only depict it with what they understood at the time. But the clear representation and similarities of Christian angels or the Sumerian Anunnaki, we have to understand it's kind of like a chicken before the egg. No, the Sumerian depictions of the Anunnaki are the oldest references that we currently have of these winged beings. And we can see that through other Semitic cultures, the term Anunnaki, through Akkadian texts and various other places in Iran and Iraq, we see these wall reliefs and inscriptions about these beings. Now, this winged disc is also carried over into obviously the Egyptian culture, the sun god Ra and Isis, again, carrying this symbolic reference to the winged disc. This is actually a clay tablet from Sumerian times that they turned into stone. They would use a cylinder seal and reverse carve these intricate pictures, and then when they roll it over wet clay, it would leave this positive imprint. And they would then just stick this piece of clay into a stove, a kiln, and literally hardening it into stone, keying that phrase writing in stone, even though they also did pictograms, which you can see, even though it's thousands of years old, very detailed. And we see the similar depictions where they're holding this staff with a point on the end that looks like a spear. Is this some type of a powerful rod of energy or something that they were utilizing? And the winged disc is always coming down on this tree, this reference to what possibly is the tree of life. Now, again, this is an Assyrian wall relief. What we also see is some of these references to a combination of hybrid beings, whether it be a sphinx, a minotaur, etc. Various hybridization projects that, if we understand the information from the ancient Sumerian texts, they very clearly explain that they did genetic intervention. The Neanderthal man that was naturally here, they put their genetic marker on them and created us in their image and after their likeness. Now again, these are stories that we'll get into in further detail, but these references to hybridization of beings make a lot more sense if we realize that our own inception was a genetic intervention and a cross hybridization between their genes and ours. Again, just like what the Bible says, they created us in their image and after their likeness. So one of the more exciting aspects, obviously, about this information is that all throughout these various scenes with gods or angels, we see clear depictions of the power of flight and very accurate intrinsic details that are synonymous with the power of craft today, and not so much a bird or an insect, which would be the natural characteristics that you might see of just giving them wings. As we discussed earlier, any type of large energy source flying through our gaseous atmosphere, nitrogen, oxygen, these are going to interact with a large power source by producing photons, beams of light. Anyone filming a high energy source craft today most likely gets just a ball of light, beams of light, a bright object in the sky. Well, this is nothing new. You can see from a fresco done by Saint Giovanni of the Madonna, and out of reference here, she's holding baby Jesus. What's interesting, though, is that you can see that there's a gentleman standing here and a dog next to him, and they're both clearly looking up in observation of this glowing craft. Now, this craft has some very interesting characteristics. It looks like it has to be what are portals around the side, and it has very clear characteristics of what we see today in modern UFO reports. A disc-shaped curved surface on the top and a dark underside. And again, emanating rays of energy. It's some type of large energy source that's flying in the sky, enough to catch their attention. So this should really raise some questions, again, as to why would they be depicting something that doesn't look like a comet, doesn't look like an asteroid, doesn't look like a cloud. It looks like a UFO, 100%. And this is something that we see over and over, as these depictions of flight very accurately representing either the ability to fly or in great detail saying they were witnessing beings that had the power of flight. Now, this is a Sumerian statue of the god Ishtar, and whether or not this disc is just symbolic as, again, she was flying in a disc with the wings and the disc. This is a very interesting story that talks about how the god Ishtar, she was a very attractive god and liked to roam the skies of Earth in her skycraft. And she would choose certain men to come into her sky abode. And of course they accepted, she's a beautiful goddess. But then they would never return. So there was a story of King Gilgamesh, another ancient Sumerian king, who was 2/3 Anunnaki. And he was invited by Ishtar to come into her sky abode. And he said, no, no, no. Thank you anyways, but I've seen how none of the men ever return, and I'd like to not walk down that path. Also, the sun god, or excuse me, the Egyptian god Isis, again depicted with wings. And again, could these be a symbolic reference to having landing gear? When they would ascend or descend, you can clearly see that they would have the ability to use this landing gear as they're coming down or going up. So again, very interesting characteristics that are symbolic to what might have been visualizations of them seeing these gods ascending and descending in their various craft. Now, it's not just speculation that we see beings depicted with wings. Again, we have artifacts that we can scientifically analyze and say that, while this might have been depicted as a bird model, what we see looks more like an actual, model airplane. Characteristics more intrinsic to a modern-day aircraft. And this object was found in the tomb of I believe it was a governor in Saqqara, Egypt. And, again, when we study many of these various depictions, not just one sole object, but many of these that have similar characteristics to the power of flight, they're clearly not being depicted as flying animals and insects. They are the natives' culture at the ability at that time to depict what they saw. And so when we see references of a flying turtle or what appear to be flying insects, to me, it's very possible that these are actual representations of what they saw, craft being flown at that time. Now, there is a term, too, you can Google this, called cargo cult. And this is something that we've seen happen throughout the ages in even more recent times. Just like these artifacts are coming from thousands of years ago, what ancient man was probably seeing, we also have in more recent times the term cargo cult. And in World War I and World War II, when American soldiers first started to fly over Aboriginal locations in Australia and South America, and they never interacted with a white man or even seen technology, these soldiers land in their biplanes, set up camps, and, walk over to an Aboriginal and light up a cigarette and hold out our voice recorder and record their voice. The Aboriginals don't understand and think that all of this technology, these guys must be gods that have come down in their magical living craft. They don't even understand that the plane isn't alive. And so some interesting things happen is these soldiers have their encampment. They have shipments that are flown over and drop shipped into the soldier camp. Well, sometimes these shipments wouldn't land in the soldier camp. They'd land right in the middle of the tribe. And the tribe would be like, well, what is this? And they would rip it open, and they find canned food and weapons and guns and knives and tools. These are things from the gods. They didn't understand. So eventually the soldiers leave and fly away. And what do the Aboriginals do? They scrape away runways. Very similar to what we see in Nazca, even though we know those weren't necessarily runways, but they could have been things representing runways to lure back just like what the Aboriginals were doing. They would scrape away runways, and they would make straw models just out of branches of these craft. Biplanes, prop planes, very similar to what we have today, an accurate representation based on just what they were visually seeing. So I think a lot of these items are exactly that, evidence of a cargo cult. They saw and were seeing things and did their best to carve them in wall reliefs and make intricate craft and artifacts to, resonate what they had held to be very sacred information or momentous events. So again, these depictions are again more intrinsic with an actual aircraft. They don't look like a wing of a bird. They look like the wing of a space shuttle or of a plane with a 90-degree tail fin and a rudder. These again look more like an ancient representation of a plane. Zecharia Sitchin found this while touring in a museum in Turkey, and I believe while they were looking through some artifacts that weren't on display. That's the other beauty of, let me just divert for a second. That's the beauty of a lot of our museums around the world, is they have a public display of artifacts, and they continually rotate what's in their collection to bring in, the locals and various people to see these exhibits that they rotate. But the key thing to understand is when you visit museums around the world, they have a vast collection of artifacts that aren't always on display. They rotate them. Some of the artifacts don't ever make it on display. So this was an item that Zecharia Sitchin found in a Turkish museum while reviewing some of the artifacts not currently on display, and they didn't know how to label it, because essentially you can see it's very rocket-like, and the curator didn't know how to explain it, so they just never really displayed it. Obviously, Zecharia Sitchin, his eyebrows kind of raised a little, and you can see in comparison to a modern-day spaceship, or our space shuttle, here's the nose. Here's what appears to be the pilot with his knees bent. His head is missing, unfortunately. And again, it's a rocket. These are engines. What else could this be but a rocket ship? Unless it's some type of a land speeder, but no, it looks very clearly similar to a space shuttle. And Zecharia Sitchin, after further convincing the curator, said, listen, I understand that you don't want to label it, but why don't you at least put it on display as unknown, or we don't have a label for this. And eventually, through enough pressure, they did exhibit it a few times, referencing Zecharia Sitchin's work, probably to get more business. They should probably be doing that today. Now, other artifacts that I found in looking through various archives at the British Museum, the Louvre, there are depictions outside of what I am specifically looking for, which is Sumerian and various other Semitic languages and visual references of the winged beings. But what we also see are other references that come out of various other areas that have this similar reference of interacting with beings coming down from the heavens, or even some type of ascension process, which of course William Henry is a big fan of, the author William Henry. Some type of interaction with beings that had the power of flight, or actually helped us return to the heavens. I'm not really sure what this is depicting, but I always found it interesting to look at these various references. And again, there are on display references from the museum that are translated by archaeologists and linguists, and really mainstream science, where they have problems with people like Zecharia Sitchin or fundamentalist Christians. Actually would guarantee you that if you asked anybody that has said Sitchin is discredited, or Zecharia Sitchin has been disproved, why don't you ask that person if they also disprove the ancient astronaut theory? I bet you'll get a yes. Sitchin was one of the very few people that looked at the evidence from a ubiquitous standpoint, realizing that there's only a few hundred people in the world that can actually translate Sumerian cuneiform script. Again, it's the similarities of these beings coming down and having interaction with us. It's not just the Sumerian culture and the Anunnaki. We see these depictions coming from all cultures around the world. Now, again, some of the information gets a little bit more interesting when we look at some of the similarities with modern-day alien interactions and abduction scenarios. We've had these depictions that come out of ancient times, 7000 BC era, out of the Ubaid culture, or Ubad culture, ancient Iraq have these depictions of what appear to be either reptilian or what I would consider to be android-like beings. Many of the depictions accompanied with these come with texts that talk about various beings that looked like this. There were actually certain questions that you would ask them to know whether it was alive or acting as if. Now, to me, that sounds like a robot or an android of some kind. But we also have to understand that these depictions of these helper beings to the Anunnaki, they're cited as flying their craft, helping in medical experiments. Well, that sounds very much like what we have with a lot of the modern day abduction scenarios. These watchers, these helpers, very well likely could be abducting people and taking genetic information, reproductive information, hybridization, and communicating or working with the overall creators here in this project, humanity, the Anunnaki. If they were able to genetically modify us, why wouldn't they be able to also genetically modify the Greys or have some interaction with a cloning race that they've used to help, essentially be intelligent androids? So these references to these ancient Sumerian versions of android beings or gray aliens, again, I think there's a similar overtone to what we're still experiencing today with these beings, that it's very possible that there's a large connection with what we have with modern day alien abductions, always having to do with reproduction and genetic material and hybridization. I mean, there have been people that have claimed to have been taken on board the craft after having, several abduction experiences and then being brought out a hybrid baby. And they clearly know that when the aliens bring this child to the mother or the father, they know that it's theirs. And the aliens don't let them keep them. So you can look into this information, the star children or these various abduction scenarios where hybrids are being created. But maybe this has been happening again for thousands of years if we realize that the Anunnaki originally created us with a genetic intervention. Why couldn't they have also intervened with other races and other species? So, these depictions of these greys or these ancient helpers are reported around the world, and we see them in various depictions, even going back to, the Stone Age and various Aboriginal cultures that, again, might have also been being abducted and had genetic experimentation being done on them, and recorded these visitations from these types of beings. Now, one thing that I've really started to find an interesting piece of information is the reference of these serpent gods. In South American cultures, as you'll see, we have various Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl. They're always depicted as these serpent gods. And even in ancient Japan, various emperors and kings were depicted as lineage from actual dragons. So we have to wonder if these references to serpent gods, whether they are, for all intents and purposes, part of our ecosystem here on Earth, or possibly actual extraterrestrials visiting us. We have to understand that there is a long heritage of reptilian presence here on Earth. The dinosaurs were here for millions of years. What if the Anunnaki experimented on them? What if some genetic variation of dinosaurs was created and an intelligent reptilian upright reptile was created? Now, I say this in all sincerity, folks, because around the world, the mythical tales of these serpent gods is all throughout our culture. And he's even in our modern day, things like, the TV show V and various references to these reptilian aliens. So let's kind of explore that topic. Many of the South American cultures still have blood rituals and ceremonies without the actual sacrifice today that for thousands of years were used to appease the gods. There would be bloodletting, where they would capture a rival tribesman and slit their throat and capture all their blood in a big goblet and offer it to the deity or the gods, which were always serpent gods, reptilian gods. Some of the priests would actually even drink the blood, thinking that they were taking over the power of their rival tribesmen. Yeah. But we have to realize that these symbolic references are carried out even today in rituals played out in modern times. And these gods are always depicted with very colorful dress and have these reptilian overtones, some type of serpent god, if you will. And the various depictions of these gods have been memorialized in statues as well as monuments that, again, display a type of brilliance and an understanding to technology that we just can't really attribute to just ancient man. There had to have been some type of lost knowledge passed down to them, or direct intervention giving them the knowledge to do and create these amazing artifacts and edifices that we're about to look at. Now, as we've seen, the Mayans had a very accurate calendar system to predict when certain events were going to take place. Their prediction long count calendar said that in certain time frames, momentous events would also reoccur in the future, like their god Viracocha returning. Now, unfortunately, on the date predicted for Viracocha's return in the past, who shows up but the conquistadors? And while depicted very similar to Viracocha, there was a miscommunication where the Mayans opened up to the conquistadors, and essentially the conquistadors aggressively converted all the Mayans to Christianity and burned all their codices. Bummer. But what's interesting to note is what played out there was, if we realize that the conquistadors were misidentified gods. Why? South American people are all dark-skinned, dark hair. Their gods, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, are depicted as pale beings, red hair, white hair. This is how they thought their gods looked like. Not at all like their native dark-skinned, dark hair population. Very interesting. So a lot of the depictions of these current Inca and Mayan characters still have the symbolic references of the rituals that they played out while interacting with these serpent beings. And they've left us artifacts and edifices that today mimic various pieces of information that we still use today in symbolic references. While this is two serpents entwined, it's also a very similar reference to a DNA strand. In any medical institution today, you'll see the two entwined serpents, which again are a representation from thousands of years ago in understanding this is what our DNA strand looks like. Now, this serpent information is encoded all over South America in various structures, in walls, and even in large pyramidal form. This idea of a serpent or a dragon is, again, not only in South America, but around the world. We have these depictions of dragons coming out of ancient times. And if it wasn't just a mythical creature, that would be one thing. But emperors and kings discuss having this lineage. And so that you understand that this isn't just made up, think about the most biblical references we have. The serpent in the Garden of Eden. In the Gospel of Philip, Cain was actually brought to life by Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Various other Emperor Augustus, Alexander the Great, all claim to have this serpent lineage. So a lot of these references to dragons possibly actually interacting or mating with humans at some point, or having these hybridization projects between this species and humanity, is very interesting in realizing that these might have been actual creatures. Dragons might have actually walked the earth at one time. And why not? We had dinosaurs. There had to have been not just black and white, but scenarios of gray, where intelligent races of dragon, dinosaur-like beings were also interacting with humanity. Now, again, all through South America, we see these references of the serpent being clearly depicted in very great detail and in great lengths to communicate information. But what we also see is, even in modern times, we have these references of current UFO sightings that are showing us UFOs. And we have to wonder what exactly we're being shown. Most of this footage was captured by people that sent this to the local news agency, and Jaime Maussan in Mexico, who's like the infamous 60 Minutes reporter in the US, in the Mexico version, captured thousands of these what appear to be serpent-like UFOs. Now, some people would say that these are just balloons floating in the sky all connected together. And maybe that's so. But if you look at enough of this footage over and over, you'll see that there is no way that all of this footage is being faked. These are being reported currently, literally serpent UFO sightings. So the last area I kind of want to talk about is looking at In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about ancient astronomy. Now, we have to notice that every culture around the world seems to have a very accurate knowledge of ancient astronomy. Even up to this day, some of the cultures have retained this sacred information where high priests and various other pieces of their civilization recorded movements of the heavens over thousands of years. So what we're going to look at today is some of the actual physical evidence that shows this astronomical knowledge and why, perhaps, they were tracking the movements of the heavens over thousands of years. Now, one of the key places to start is to look at some of the megalithic monuments that we have all over the earth. So let's go ahead and dive in here. If we look at, for instance, Stonehenge, obviously there's been all kinds of modern academic theories as to what Stonehenge was being used for, but then there's also the other side of that explanation, which is to try and explain how such a megalithic monument could have been built. Stacking these stones in such a way would require, mechanics that would allow them to transport and then upright move these stones into position, let alone explaining the ones that they have balanced on top of these megalithic structures. But when we know for pretty much a fact today that Stonehenge seems to be a type of astronomical marker, it allows one to look at the current solstices, the summer and winter solstices, and see when certain alignments take place to mark these specific times. Now, what's really interesting here is that, again, aside from the construction of these stones, what we also have is a very accurate celestial clock, if you will, monitoring the heavens so that when certain alignments take place with the heavens and the earth, there are these markers that pinpoint that exact time. So it's very interesting to realize that the ancients were aware of a larger cycle of time, but used these megalithic monuments in tracking their astronomical positions to know when they're at certain points, when certain alignments are taking place. This was kind of like a grand celestial clock. It repeats. Everything that we see in nature repeats. The seasons, night, day, the calendar, everything is repeating. So a lot of the things that we're going to look at is this knowledge of astronomical movements that, again, was sacred information to them because they were able to see when these repeating points would come into fruition. Now, Stonehenge today is obviously still visited by quite a bit of people, and we reminisce as to when this was an actual completed circle and what its true function was for. But clearly it was being used as an astronomical outpost to mark certain positions as to when Earth came into alignment, the winter solstice, the summer solstice. So very interesting information. Now, what we also have are observations of the heavens that come from various cultures around the world, various times and epochs that spread a vast distance of our history, but share in a similar line of thinking and research, tracking certain stars in the heavens. You can see that this manuscript is basically found in Timbuktu, and it was an ancient Islamic form of, again, recording the heavens, the movements of the heavens, over thousands of years. This disc is quite interesting. It was located in ancient Germany, and a lot of times these certain depictions of what we would think to be either the sun and the moon or various astronomical symbols, we see them carried over from various cultures that did not have direct contact with each other, but have similar astronomical observations, looking at certain areas in the sky, making the same type of conclusions about what those planets were, and even giving them similar names. So we really have to wonder if there wasn't a more distant knowledge base, some ancient civilization that did influence all the ancients we know of today, Mayans and Toltecs, Egyptians, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamian. they all seem to have similar pieces of this astronomical base of data that really kind of boggles the mind. Now, this is a pretty infamous artifact known as the Antikythera mechanism, and it was found by some sponge divers in 1901 off the island of Antikythera, just near Greece there. Now, they theorized that this is probably over 2,000 years old. The only thing that they can possibly attribute to building it was maybe the great Greek mathematician and philosopher Archimedes. But we don't know for sure who actually built this device. What we do know is that under radar, it shows between 35 and 70 different cogs and wheels intricately connected and working together. It's theorized that, as an analogy, that it's more complicated than a modern day Swiss watch. So we're looking at a type of computerized device, if you will, that's possibly at least 2,000 years old. Now, the Antikythera mechanism, we know that was probably used for two devices. It seemed to be like in a box and could be used for astronomical purposes, so that if you were a ship captain, you could use the Antikythera mechanism and tune it towards a certain star or a point in space, and then use that as a way to navigate through the seas. You could also use it as an astrological device, so that if you knew that you were born on July 4th and that Mars was in alignment with you at that time of your birth, they would use the Antikythera mechanism to look and see what's likely to happen within your lifetime by looking at the alignments of what other planets and things happen within your birth date. So very interesting information where the ancients put a lot more emphasis and interest into looking into these devices that use the heavens to deduce information, as well as, again, navigational purposes. One thing I'd like to point out, which is kind of off the topic of Antikythera mechanism, is it's interesting to note that in some of the biblical references, like when the three kings, the three great magi, are coming to see baby Jesus, the story is that they used a star in the sky, the North Star, to navigate their way to find baby Jesus. That is logically not possible. A star is not a fixed point in the sky. If I started off on a journey over 3 weeks going towards the North Star is going to be continually moving throughout the night as the Earth's rotation is taking place. So maybe it wasn't a North Star. Maybe it was something else floating in the sky that was leading them to Jesus. I only bring that up because we have to realize that when we look at things like the Antikythera mechanism, where they were using this as an astronomical device to chart the heavens, maybe these three magi were actually in tune with the North Star and tracking its movements, but we're using it with some type of assisted technology to make an accurate notation for where the movements would take the North Star in our radius of view. So very interesting to notice that throughout ancient times we put great emphasis on the astronomical knowledge as well as the astrological, the meaning of what these alignments took place in your lifetime. Now, another culture obviously that had great significance in astronomical data is the Sumerian culture. Not just talking about the Anunnaki and Nibiru or Planet X, the Sumerians had very accurate astronomical data. Now, I must say that in this one cylinder seal, we do actually see a representation of the 7 dots of Earth and our crescent moon, and then the symbol of a cross for Nibiru and its crescent moon, north wind. As we know that the classic interaction recorded in some of the Sumerian creation tales, that Nibiru, a planet that they symbolize as a glowing cross, and it had a large crescent moon, did strike our primitive Earth, which is represented as 7 dots, and we also have a moon. So there is some Sumerian information that is, again, collaborative about the Nibiru story, but what we're going to look into is just the basic knowledge of their astronomy from an academic level to prove that they are saying things of veracity. Most Sumerian tablets were written in a clay tablet like you see here, and then they would fire that into a kelm, a primitive stove, literally keying that phrase, writing in stone. And you can see that their system of writing was quite interesting. They used an oversized screwdriver and turn it and twist it in the wet clay to make these characters. But the Sumerians recorded astronomical data, sometimes on semi-precious stones, as well as clay tablets. But this was sacred information. This was only passed down by the high priests over hundreds of years. We might have seen in that movie Apocalypto by Mel Gibson that at one point where there's just about to be a solar eclipse, the priest looks over at the king and kind of nods. Now it's time, for the sacrificial offering. And just before that, now the king stands up and commands the solar eclipse to take place. Excuse me, the solar eclipse. So again, this was sacred knowledge where they knew when these alignments, when they would know when eclipses and things like that were going to happen, because they observed these events and then recorded it as sacred information, knowing that these cycles repeat. So a lot of the Sumerian information actually talks about the movements of the heavens, the distance between the planets, what our planets look like as if you were in space. And again, our sciences, when we started to send space probes out there, confirm the Sumerian descriptions. So a lot of this information, our sciences can now collaborate as being accurate. They were making accurate astronomical observations thousands of years ago. Now the kicker to this is there are probably still thousands of tablets in the British Museum, in the Louvre, in Turkey, in Germany. We literally have thousands of Sumerian tablets that are still yet to be translated. Could still have further sacred data, either on astronomical or maybe even medical knowledge, certain herbs and things that when applied to the human flesh cure disease. I mean, who knows? But as far as the ancient astronomy goes, there are still a wealth of thousands of tablets yet to be translated, sitting in these various archives and museums. Museums have thousands of artifacts, and they only rotate on display certain showcases. Sometimes it's there for a month, then it's put away for a year, and then brought back. So a lot of these tablets and things literally have not even seen the light of day yet. Now, various Sumerian tablets and edifices that have these pictogram pieces of information talk about astronomical movements. This one actually has symbols, astronomical symbols, encoded into the stone. Signs of the zodiac, the 12 constellations of the zodiac. This was literally used as an ancient celestial clock. It turns out over 30 cultures, according to the book Hamlet's Mill. Thank you, Walter Cruttenden from the Binary Research Institute. But this book, Hamlet's Mill, talks about over 30 cultures that are aware of this possible dual sun, that we have a binary orbit. And this is the reason why we have this large celestial time, this cycle of 24,000 years. Now, you've heard me talk about this in other lessons, and I'm going to continue to bring this up. The lost cycle of time. Plato called it the Great Year. The Hindus and ancient Vedic texts speak of something called the cycle of the Yugas, where they broke down this division of the heavens into 12 parts as a grand celestial clock. Now today we call it the precession of the equinox. But be very clear that the same thing that we're trying to figure out today, why we see a different constellation every 2,000 years, this precession of the equinox, was clearly known to the ancients. They were very clear and built all of these monuments to mark where they were in this large cycle of time. So what we see is an unbelievable display all over the earth of very accurate astronomical observations. The idea that their ancient astronomy to them was sacred knowledge and literally affected the motions and movements and courses of their lives. And so if we look all over Mesoamerica, we can see monuments that are in great detail used as astronomical outposts, astronomical markers, places of worship, but also places of understanding these alignments. Just like in Chichen Itza, the grand serpent of Kukulkan, this pyramid, forms the shape of a serpent using a shadow by just having the sun hit it at a perfect angle once a year that causes this effect. So we do have to realize that a lot of the information, the mathematical knowledge, for instance, using the number 0, where did these things come from? A lot of it starts off with their understanding of astronomy. And the kicker is that if you ask a lot of these ancient cultures, where did you learn this sacred mathematical knowledge? Where did you learn this sacred astronomical data? We were taught this by the gods. or that it was taught by sacred information that's been passed down of thousands of years. So when we look at South America and we look at these, various pyramids, this was made infamous in Eric von Daniken's movie Chariots of the Gods, where he looked at the planets and realized that the various planets and the names that we have, sun, moon, that here in Mexico we have a collection of pyramids that seem to mimic our own solar system, and that each one, the pyramid of the sun, the pyramid of the moon, actually correspond to planets within our solar system. It's not possible that ancient man could have just made this up. There has to be some connection here with their knowledge in this advanced astronomy. Excuse me. Now, we do see that various cultures, again, created calendar systems, systems of repeating time that were based on astronomical movements. The Mayans obviously were infamous for this. But many people might not realize that there were actually 3 different calendars used by the Mayans. They had a system of calendar that allowed them to predict everyday events, a calendar of time for their lives, and then a much longer cycle of time called a series of baktuns, or predictions, that would be made over longer cycles of time in this 24,000-year cycle. So it boggles modern science today as to how the Mayans could talk about these future dates, or saying that in 2012 time ends and restarts. We don't understand that. But just understand that some of the predictions of the Mayans on these long count calendars, these baktuns, weren't always perfect. Meaning, in one of the future baktuns, they predicted that their god Kukulkan was going to return. And at the same time frame for when this prediction was made to take place, who shows up? The conquistadors. The conquistadors show up in their ships wearing all their armor, and the Mayans think that this is the returning gods, the Kukulkan. They don't understand. So what do? They open up their Maya civilization to them, give them all their gold and Aztec jewelry, and even lost cities of gold like El Dorado, possibly cities literally made of gold. And what happens? The Spanish conquistadors aggressively convert all the Mayans to Christianity and burn all of their codices, all of this lost sacred astronomical data. We have 4 codices left, and that's where you hear things about the Mayan calendar and their extensive knowledge. But there is a lot of lost data, a lot of lost knowledge. And it seems like most of the ancient cultures that we revere today all speak of some lost culture. I'm not going to call them Atlantis or Atlanteans, because they weren't something that sunk into the ocean. They were all over the planet, affecting all the great civilizations, having trade or apprenticeship with the Egyptians, the Mayans, the Aztecs, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia, China, the Hindus, Vedic texts. They all seem to have this same knowledge base of astronomical data that predates them. So again, looking at South America, you can clearly see monuments that were literally built as observatories, just like we have today, right? It would be a large circular dome that opens up for a telescope to make observations. That's the same thing that we're seeing in edifices from ancient cultures. They went to great lengths to build astronomical outposts where they made very accurate astronomical observations. And they didn't have city lights and power grids affecting their view of the heavens. They had very clear observations of the sky. Now, what we see over and over again is this knowledge of the breakdown of the heavens into 12 constellations. Why? What does this mean? Well, if we understand that most of the megalithic monuments were built to align to certain points in time and space, this is shown over and over again with megalithic monuments. Now, Giza obviously is the perfect example. When we look at the satellite of the Giza Plateau, we see that the pyramids are literally perfectly aligned, except for this one's slightly offset. Well, that's just like the 3 pyramids, the 3 stars of Orion's belt, perfectly in alignment. The third one slightly offset. Giza is a terrestrial map of Orion, and this alignment takes place in 10,500 BC. We can further
know that this date is accurate because at that same time frame, 10,500 BC, the Sphinx is looking directly east into the constellation of Leo, the lion. The three pyramids of Giza are perfectly aligned with the Orion constellation in the heavens. There is a terrestrial alignment marking 10,500 BC as some type of significance. Now, other areas in Giza, again, had this knowledge of what the skies look like thousands of years before the Egyptians were supposedly here in 2500 BC building the pyramids. Why were the pyramids, if they were built in 2500 BC, aligned to the heavens 8,000 years before that in 10,500 BC? Well, they either had knowledge of their civilization going much further back, or they themselves go much further back. Even the inner walls of the Sphinx, you can see the little tiny blow up of the Sphinx right there. The inner walls of the Sphinx, here's the Sphinx, they show extensive weathering on these walls. It's been inundated by water, massive rain flowing and causing these rain geological evidence on the inner walls of the Sphinx. Last time it was raining on the plateaus of Giza was 10,000 years ago. Now, if we look at other areas in Egypt, specifically Dendera, amazing astronomical data is found there, as well as some technological reliefs. Notice this symbol of the winged disc, very prominent on the entrance. Dendera has a clear representation of astronomical symbols. Most specifically is this Dendera wall relief, literally on the ceiling. Inscribed on the ceiling shows a view of constellations that were in view of the sky 8,000 years before they were supposedly around. We're talking at around 8,000 BC, having wall reliefs and things that denote information, astronomical views of the heavens, where the Egyptians weren't even supposed to have been there. Yet they have very clear astronomical plates, this Dendera wall relief, and this is the actual relief. You can see the detail that they went in inscribing this onto the ceiling. But they're talking about constellations. They're talking about movements of the heavens, a view of the sky from thousands of years before the Egyptian culture should have even have existed. So we have to understand that this information can't just be by chance. It can't just be, as the academics would say, they were star worshippers and built a monument that aligns to a star and leave it at that. No, no. This is a very serious topic. They went to great lengths to build these alignments because it's a repeating cycle that takes place. Now, most of the astronomical movements today, we can understand. This larger cycle of time, this great year, is something that's very hard for us to conceive of simply because of the length of time. A 24,000 year cycle. Very hard for us to comprehend. But these ancient cultures went to great lengths to convey visual information about what was taking place in their time and the significance of tracking these moments in time that repeat. Okay, so if we look at other areas in Egypt, this is called Nabta Playa. This is possibly one of the oldest locations that are being used as, again, a type of primitive Stonehenge, a way to use the shadows and the markers to mark various movements in the heavens. Now, we have to understand that there are these three cycles of time. Two of them are a lot easier for us to understand, but this larger 24,000 year cycle is still hard for us to comprehend. But the ancients seem to have had a much firmer grasp on this knowledge. We'll have to look into this further as we do these lessons and looking at this lost cycle of time. The Egyptians, again, are one of the few cultures that really provide us this lost base of knowledge, where they had boats that talk about taking the soul into the next life. Literally, the Egyptian Book of the Dead is like 800 pages, and it talks about how the pharaoh would prepare in their lifetime, or a Mayan king. Various other cultures had similar ways of preparing the soul for the travel into the afterlife. And it always involved going into the heavens, going into the stars. It's almost as if they had some type of a knowledge that, the Mayans talked about where the king would have to pass through certain doorways and interact with certain beings Egyptians, the same thing in their Egyptian Book of the Dead, talk about these various things that they have to do to carry their kingship into the next life by having this sacred knowledge taught to them in this life. Again, the worship and knowledge of the Son. You know, we hear this term, the Son of God, for Jesus Christ, the Son of God. All cultures worshiped the sun, the actual sun, the disk. So this is the life-giving force, and it's very interesting to realize that not only did they pay attention to astronomical movements, but gave great reverence to various stars and things like our own sun. So the Egyptians, I think, are really a great culture for us to look at, the acronyms and hieroglyphic information, where they're conveying a much deeper understanding of knowledge than we could convey in a written text. Remember, a picture is always worth 1,000 words. The Egyptians were very astute at using hieroglyphic visuals. You know, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, FYI, for your information. Those 3 letters, FYI, we know mean several different words. The Egyptians were the same way. They used hieroglyphic imagery to represent many different words. This tells a much deeper story than we could with a written word. So we have to realize that some of these symbolic references of the sun, understanding that they didn't have telescopes or knowledge of advanced equations and math, yet they made accurate astronomical observations without the aid of technology. Observations that are not possible without the aid of technology. The Dogon tribe in Africa, understanding that they could see Sirius A and B, that it was 2 suns, 2 separate suns, one bigger, one smaller, in an orbit around each other, are always depicted accurately. And interestingly enough, some of the Dogon hieroglyphics, which I'm going to call them that, are very similar in alignment with Egyptian cosmology, Egyptian symbology, completely separate continents, Africa, Egypt, thousands of years in difference in culture. The people, the Dogon tribe in Africa, still cut off from civilization today, but having accurate symbols, sharing cosmology. Again, the 3 belt stars of Orion, aligning with the pyramids. The Dogon tribe in Africa, clearly giving representations of Sirius A and B in the Orion constellation. And these are primitive people, even today, that retain this sacred astronomical data and pass it down through their cultures. When it gets into the hands of modern science, we go, wait a minute, how is this possible that thousands of years ago they were making accurate astronomical observations? So this really raises a lot of questions about Sirius A and B and various other planet systems that we have out there. Was this information given to the ancient man because gods literally came from those points in space, the Orion constellation, Sirius A and B? What if there are other planets that orbit the suns for Sirius A and B? It's even possible that Sirius A and B are our second binary sun. Now, these are topics we're not going to explore in today's lesson, but the answers lie in the heavens. Looking at the astronomical data is really going to give us new information as we start to further understand our sciences. Petroglyphs and things that go back thousands of years make these representations of astronomical data, observations of the heavens, and sometimes things, beings that came down from the heavens while they were making these observations. So it's very interesting to note that, again, over 30 cultures talk about this reference of dual suns. So the 24,000-year cycle that we have today, known as the precession of the equinox, they actually say it's a little over 26,000 years. But, as we're going to find out through more recent data and studying these ancient cultures, the precession of the equinox is more tightly seen as a 24,000-year cycle, caused by the binary orbit of our 2 suns. Now, we haven't yet proven that we have 2 suns, but all the other solar systems that we're looking at external from ours are binary. They have at least 2 suns. So it's very possible that just as all these ancient cultures, over 30, as written about in Hamlet's Mill, talk about the idea of this dual sun orbit, this is possibly what's causing this rise and fall of civilizations here on Earth. Everyone's heard of the Golden Age. Everyone's heard of the Dark Ages. That's a repeating cycle, a 24,000-year cycle. 12,000 years of going into the Golden Age and 12,000 years descending out of the Golden Age. And it repeats. I think the reason why is because we're in a binary orbit. It's very possible that our suns, the energy from our sun, the reason why the Egyptians and all these various cultures worship the energy of the sun, the life-giving force, is that if we're a binary system, when the suns are at their closest point in orbit, the energy coincides with us being in the Golden Age. We reach a point where we're able to interpret God. That's pretty heavy. That's what's talked about in these ancient Mahabharata and ancient Vedic texts. So when the suns are at their farthest points, we're in the Dark Ages. It's kind of like HBO's Game of Thrones. We forget all of the sacred knowledge and interaction with these higher beings, and it becomes more just a physical reality. Well, we're finding more of a balance. And I think that it's interesting to realize that all these ancient cultures were aware of this cycle of time. It's not a linear thing. We were ever so simplistic and are going to become more ever so complex. It's a cycle that's repeating. Now, through that cycle, there are gradual, probably evolutionary cycles even beyond this 24,000 one. But that's pretty heavy in itself, understanding that there's a 24,000-year cycle of evolution, which is repeating here on Earth. So we can really look back at a lot of these ancient texts, the Mahabharata and Vedic texts, talking about times that go back 10,000 years. And again, they have this knowledge of this sacred astronomy. We really need to pay closer attention to this information. And I love this analogy that, there's an insect here on Earth that only lives 24 hours. So we're talking about a 24,000-year cycle. In comparison to us and living 100 years, here's an insect that lives 24 hours. So if a mayfly is born on a cloudy day, no sunlight, and another mayfly comes up and says, I've heard this rumor of sunshine and a breeze, but they don't see it, and they die on that same cloudy day. That doesn't mean that the sun or that the wind does not exist. So in our 24,000-year cycle here on Earth, just because we live a small fraction of time doesn't mean that we can't further comprehend what all these ancient cultures seem to be aware of, this lost cycle of time that affects our rise and fall of civilization here on Earth. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the topic of Nibiru, or ancient Planet X. Now, this is a very interesting topic simply because, being raised as a Christian for myself, there are many references to, in Revelations, things like Armageddon or Wormwood or some type of apocalyptic biblical event that we hear about in ancient times being tied to things like the Great Flood. Now, a lot of this information told in even the Old Testament in Hebrew, as well as the English version, the King James New Testament, are consolidated versions of a much longer epic of creation found in the original stone versions of the Sumerian culture. And this is really where the term Nibiru, planet of the crossing, starts to come into play. And anyone who's learned about these topics like Planet X or Nibiru from looking online can see that there's a vast amount of interest in today's search for this ancient Planet X. We'll talk about the modern Planet X in an upcoming lesson. Today, we want to focus on the specific points of evidence around the ancient Planet X, Nibiru, the knowledge talked about when this planet was visible in the sky, as well as what ramifications it has had in the ancient past. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some of the evidence. When we study the original biblical story, we can see that this idea of a great flood permeates into many different cultures. Now, I focus specifically on the Sumerian culture, which is pretty much today's modern-day Iraq. We've heard it known as Mesopotamia and Babylon, but originally at around 3800 BC, we have Sumer. And amongst the thousands of stone tablets from the Sumerian culture, we have references of these beings, the Anunnaki, coming from a very specific point within our solar system, a planet called Nibiru. So let's kind of explore some of this factual data that talks about this planet Nibiru and its interaction with our ancient planet Earth. Now, this is one of the most infamous tablets known from the Sumerian lexicon of information. It's called the Enuma Elish. It consists of over several tablets that tell a much more elongated tale about life and creation in general. And it speaks of not only our solar system and the planets coming into existence, but more specifically us, and why there was a great flood. Not that there was just a great flood, but what caused this great flood. And it was the passing of this planet Nibiru. The actual home world of the gods comes close to the inner part of our solar system. And when this took place thousands of years ago in the past, maybe even millions of years ago, we know that it's had catastrophic effects here on Earth. So the Enuma Elish is a very interesting text simply because of the fact that it tells us all of the information in this Sumerian version that we find in the Hebrew and New Testament in English of our biblical tales. So, like for instance, 7 days of creation in Genesis. Well, there were actually 7 tablets of creation as part of this much longer epic of Enuma Elish. So we must understand that a lot of these biblical references for the Great Flood, speaking of times when there were giants upon the earth, most of this information are just consolidated stories coming from the original derivatives. These are just derivatives from the original story that we find in Sumerian versions. So we want to ask the question is what caused the Great Flood? Nibiru passes Earth in the past, and we've seen that it has had actual gravitational effects and has caused, a great flood in the past. Now, if we look at some of this evidence, we can see that not only is this knowledge of the flood real, but it extends, again, all the way back to the Sumerian times. There is actually a tablet on display in the British Museum as the flood tablet. And just like Noah in the English Bible, we have a version in Sumerian where a Sumerian man, Utnapishtim, is chosen by an Anunnaki, a Sumerian god, to build a large craft and take his family and plants and animals from the region and load it onto this ship because of the large flood that's going to be taking place. And in this version, in the Enuma Elish, in this longer epic, they actually explain that as planet Nibiru passed by Earth in the past, it caused one of the great ice sheets to crack off, and it's like dropping a piece of ice in a glass of water. The water levels just raise instantly. So we have a much longer tale explaining why there was a great flood, and it has to do with this ancient planet X, or Nibiru, passing by us, having gravitational effects that cause the ice sheet to crack off and instantly raise our water levels. So we have to realize that the Great Flood, while it's still looked upon as mythology, we are finding evidence to substantiate this from even further references back in time to this possibly being an actual event that did take place. We have evidence too of this ancient mapping system, or an idea that there was knowledge of all of the continents extending well into our history, well beyond the ability to aerial document pieces of topography. Now, this ancient map, the Perry Reese map, you can see the original here, is very interesting because you can see it has the North and South Pole, all the land masses, every continent listed, the types of animals found within those regions. And no one has an understanding as to how they would be able to accurately map the topography of such a map that goes back, again, well into our history. And there are several references to maps like this. It wasn't just the Perry Reese map, there's also the Phineas map. The Phineas map is of substantial interest simply because it shows the actual topography of the landmass underneath the ice. Now, we have to realize that there's probably at least a mile thick of ice, and somehow we have maps that are accurately depicting what is underneath the ice. So there's no way that they could have an aerial advantage to see this, let alone the ability to accurately depict the landmass underneath the ice. Now, when we hear this idea of an ancient planet X, we have to understand, or a Nibiru, that the Sumerian version of our solar system had a much, or not much, but a slightly different view of how we classify the planets now. We think that Earth is the third planet from the sun, whereas if you look at the solar system model of coming from outside in, Earth is actually the seventh planet. Sacred number 7, 7 days in a week. It's a very interesting number that we'll come back to. But you can see that this is not to scale. It's an artist rendition to show you that the Sumerian version of our solar system was of 12 planets. They counted the 9 planets that we know of, our sun, our moon, and then this additional planet, Nibiru, as the 12th member of our solar system. And so it's a very interesting piece of information that they're actually stating that their gods, the Anunnaki, come from this 12th planet. This number 12 permeates through all of the ancient cultures and even up today to knowledge that we use. If you think about it, you know, the 12 disciples of Jesus, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 Greek Olympians, 12 hours in a day, 12 inches in a foot, 12 months in a year, the 12 zodiacal breakdown of the heavens. I think I even said 12 inches in a foot. I might have said that twice, but this number 12, again, permeates through all of our knowledge that we still use today and is traced back to this idea of an ancient planet X, Nibiru, the 12th planet as the home of the gods. Now, what we can see about the Sumerian evidence as to why we would even give credence to this ancient planet X, Nibiru, is that most of the astronomical data that they've left us that we can confirm, we see that they are on the level. We can see that they've recorded accurate information over hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, recording astronomical events. And these tablets were sacred information, only knowledge held by the high priests. So it's not like everyone in the Sumerian culture knew of this astronomical data. This was sacred information, only held by the high priests and passed down over hundreds of years. You could ask a certain astronomer, a Sumerian astronomer, and they would be able to tell you 50 years in advance on what day there would be a solar or a lunar eclipse. So they made very accurate, observations of the skies, just like many other cultures did, and passed this down as sacred information. And many of the biblical references that they talked about actually explain the stars not as living objects, as some modern linguists and archaeologists would interpret, but as physical places that had a life essence. Things like the Earth or Nibiru, or the ways that they would travel to get from Earth to Nibiru, were actually well documented as actual information. So we have to understand that a culture from 6,000 years ago is giving us accurate astronomical data that we now confirm as being accurate. But the kicker of this information is they talk about another planet which we still have yet to confirm, a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. And if we do discover this planet, this is Nibiru, the ancient planet X, where we possibly have ancestors living on that planet. So to understand that they were making very accurate astronomical points of reference is key to interpreting the data when it comes to Nibiru. Now, one of the key pieces that we see here is the fact that, again, they had all this knowledge about our current solar system. They gave the distance between the planets, what the planets look like in outer space, and incidentally calling Earth the 7th planet. Because if you count from outside in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Earth is the 7th planet. So this is pretty interesting information when we realize that not until the late 70s and early 80s, when we sent the Galileo and the Voyager probe out to the outer solar system and finally took pictures of the outer planets, and we see that Uranus and Neptune being bluish green, or as the Sumerians called it, mosh sieg. The Sumerians gave accurate depictions of the outer planets, what the planets even look like from space. And then finally, when we send our probes there, we confirm this 6,000-year-old information. Now, the kicker of the information, again, is around planet Nibiru. They clearly reference this other planet. They reference it as a large, glowing red planet. They reference it as a cross, a glowing cross in the sky. A glowing cross. Now, keep in mind, the Sumerian culture is at 3800 BC. The time of Jesus, we're talking about 2014, is roughly 2,000 years ago. If you go back from BC to AD, that point of when Jesus was here, we're going back another 2,000 years from when Jesus was here, and you're at the Sumerian culture. So the whole idea that the Sumerian culture are depicting their gods coming from a glowing cross in the sky thousands of years before Jesus and the crucifixion, again, is somewhat interesting. Nibiru, again, is always depicted as a large glowing red planet, and it has its own moon too, so just keep that in mind as we progress through this. Various depictions of Nibiru initially showed it as a glowing cross in the sky. Eventually it started to migrate into more of a circular winged disc, also taking on the shape of a cross in the middle. Eventually you can see as it's transgressed, we see it even in other cultures today, in Egyptian as well as Akkadian and various other Semitic languages, referencing the winged disc as reference to the gods. Here's an actual Sumerian seal, a depiction from a seal, where during daylight you can see the sun is being referenced, and then also Nibiru as a glowing cross seen during daylight time, and they're making reference to it. You can see that they're plowing a field here. So a lot of visual references to understand the lineage of information visually for how they explained planet Nibiru. Now, what's really key about planet Nibiru is the story in the Enuma Elish, this great creation myth that's on several stone tablets, talks about how Nibiru became a part of our solar system, and talks to this great collision and interaction with our ancient planet Earth. Now, what's really interesting about this information is the idea that even through our modern cosmology, we date the solar system to be about 4.7 billion years old. That there was, at some point, some large explosion, and over time, our solar system and the planets have coalesced into the objects that they are today. Now, this isn't very far off from what the Sumerians tell us, again, in a 6,000-year-old tale recorded in stone tablets of an interaction with this intruder planet, and how it fits very much in alignment with the cosmology and creation of our solar system. If we think about the idea of such, a large planetary event of planets colliding or moons striking other planets, these would be solar system-wide effects, things that would be left for us to see thousands of years later and trace back the evidence, like we do now in trying to understand the Big Bang Theory. We see evidence that in our own solar system in the past, there was some large intruder planet that caused a great havoc on our solar system. And it turns out the Sumerians explain it in a much more detailed way than our science can yet convey. The Sumerian version speaks of an intruder planet, which we'll call Planet X, or Nibiru, was gravitationally affected by the outer planets of our solar system. And this is before the planets were solid masses yet. They hadn't finished coalescing. Nibiru is pulled into the inner part of our solar system, so it starts having an actual orbit around our main sun. Now, through the Sumerian tales, they explain that on one of these successive orbits, Nibiru came so close to our primitive Earth that Nibiru's moon whacked our Earth. You see that the Sumerians labeled Nibiru, or Planet X's moon, as North Wind. And North Wind hit Earth in such a way that it literally cracked Earth in two, causing Earth to be moved with our moon, moved into a new orbit, leaving the remnants of the asteroid belt, which we still see today. And the Bible references the asteroid belt as the hammered out bracelet. Remember, those are consolidated tales of this original Sumerian version. So after Nibiru has this interaction where its moon whacks our primitive Earth, causing the asteroid belt, Nibiru then goes on to have this long 3,600-year orbit. We don't understand why it has such a long orbit or what causes it to stay in this orbit, other than to speculate there must be a second sun. Imagine my cursor is another sun. Nibiru is orbiting around a second sun, a brown dwarf, something that we've known about for a long time, probably longer than we think, which I'm going to touch about on the end, touching on this lost cycle of time. But this is a new variable to explain Nibiru's orbit being able to go way far out and loop back around. It's probably going around the second sun. Now, the Sumerians gave this visual a name. They called a completed orbit a shar. And it was 3,600 years was what they denoted as a complete shar. Now, if you just drop 1 0, you have 360 degrees, which was also the first value given to a circle by the Sumerians, 360 degrees, or add a 0 and it's a shar, a completed circle. Now, if we think about the idea of a great collision cracking our Earth into half a planet, then this brings up some interesting questions again about our very early cosmology. We understand the idea of Pangaea, that at one point the continents were all connected. We can see it. If we look at our map today, we can, without a doubt, confirm that all the continents actually connect in some way, where you can see that this continent would connect into here, this one into here. They literally all kind of move up into each other. They all fit. So that, again, is confirming the Sumerian cosmology that we're half a planet, one landmass. Now, all planets siphon into a sphere, but if you sucked off all the water, it'd just be a chunk of land. And like the skin of an apple, our land masses have just kind of moved into where they are now, but they were originally just one chunk of land. Now, you know, a lot of people have asked about Nibiru's current orbit in the fact that in ancient times, we know that it had this interaction that caused part of the great ice sheet to crack off and have a great flood. We know that it has an orbit that lasts 3,600 years based on the Sumerian information. And we know that our solar system has roughly been around for 4.7 billion years. So if we take the idea that our solar system is 4.7 billion years old, and Nibiru, Planet X, has been looping in the solar system in that whole time, which takes 3,600 years for it to complete an orbit, we can simply do a mathematical equation and see that Nibiru is passed through the inner part of the solar system well over 1 million times. It's very possible that not every time it passes through the inner part of the solar system that it's going to have an effect here on Earth. We're talking about three-dimensional space. Nibiru could be here, the sun could be here, and the Earth way over here. Now, another interesting thing to note is that if we look at the distance between the planets spatially to each other, we can see that where the asteroid belt is, this remnants from that, you know, last collision of Nibiru and Earth in the ancient past, we see that where the asteroid belt is, there's clearly enough room between Mars and Jupiter for Nibiru to pass through. Another thing to note, if we think about this Planet X being the 12th planet, and the 12th planet passes between Mars and Jupiter, well, then we could take the analogy of MJ12 could possibly mean something. If you don't know what that term is, you can Google it, MJ12. So just getting to the point that, again, Nibiru possibly doesn't always have gravitational effects on Earth every time it's close by the inner part of our solar system. Now, ancient knowledge of Nibiru. This is rather interesting because, as we can see, there's been a great deal of information explaining the cosmology of our solar system with this original collision with Nibiru and Planet X. Well, on the Discovery Channel recently, they explained that a rogue planet collides with our primitive Earth. And in doing so, the remnant fragments coalesce to make our moon. They called this the Orpheus theory. Well, that sounds very similar to the Sumerian versions of the cosmology creation of our solar system. So as they're trying to figure it out, All they need to do is look to the past to find the answers. Even until recent times, the idea of a planet on an elongated orbit was far-fetched to NASA. They had yet to image any type of extrasolar planet or star in an orbit that was not a perfect circle or was on some highly elliptical orbit, if you will. Well, they found one. Here it is, a little star going around, a planet going around a much larger star that, again, this isn't our solar system, but it's on a highly elliptical orbit. And they found that this became the norm, finding planets that were dancing around binary solar systems. Most solar systems, in fact, that we're filming outside of our own, using the Hubble and other telescopes, which we'll look into in the next lesson, the modern search for Planet X. But there's a great deal of new astronomical data to show that the orbits that we thought were just impossible are now becoming the norm, and that our solar system itself is possibly binary, 2 suns. Where's our second sun, you would ask? So when we look at this evidence of Nibiru, we have to understand that this information is kind of new to us. It's kind of being rediscovered. Even through the ages, just coming out of the Dark Ages until the Renaissance time, we thought we orbited, we didn't realize that we orbited the sun. We thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. Through the work of Copernicus and Galileo and others, we've discovered that we actually orbit the sun. Well, this information was well known to the Sumerians. Again, there is this cycle of time, which I'm going to continually weave into the lessons as I talk about it, but it seems as if during the Sumerian and Egyptians 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, they had high astronomy and knew all this information. And then we dip into the Dark Ages and lose all this information. And only coming out of the Dark Ages, Copernicus, Galileo, we start to re-understand astronomy as to where we are today, almost 4,000 years later, with an understanding and an acceptance of our solar system model. But we're still learning. The Sumerians clearly pointed out that they too knew that the sun was in the center thousands of years ago. It's almost like, again, we had to rediscover this information. But you can see on this Sumerian tablet that the sun is in the center, and they depict all of the known planets that we know of in their correct size and order. But they've included one more, Nibiru, Planet X. So when we look at our solar system model and understand that they speak of our solar system from seeing it from the outside, from their venture coming into the solar system, seeing us as not on the third rock, but on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 planets we passed before we came to Ki, the 7th planet. Here's a blow-up of that seal. Some very interesting details in the seal. You can see that this priest is leading another man to the seated God, and he's granting man the plow. But as a backdrop to this information, we have an accurate model of our solar system. And right below that, we have what appears to be a rocket on a launching pad. Like a modern-day rocket ship, it sits on a pad. It's being held up by a support that will fall away once the rocket takes off into the stars. On a 6,000-year-old tablet, they're depicting this type of information. So we have to understand that this probably isn't mythology, folks. These are real events. Nibiru is a real planet, and the beings, the Anunnaki, are real themselves. Now, when we look at the evidence of the Anunnaki, again, we've seen great details and information given to us by the Sumerian culture, where they went to great lengths to explain, describe this interaction with what the Bible once called, there were giants upon the earth. Well, the Sumerians were living in that epoch of time. They called these beings the Anunnaki. And over, even the modern day depictions of angels in the Bible are speaking of a much earlier epoch of time where we have earlier references of these beings, the Anunnaki. And where do they come from? Not just the heavens, from planet Nibiru. So we have to understand that if we ever actually do find this ancient Planet X, not Sedna or Quoar or Xena or these things that are demoting Pluto, they're finding little ice balls floating out there. Ancient Nibiru is 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. It's a big planet. We're not going to miss it. And if we do locate that planet, we possibly have ancestors that live on that planet. So we have to understand that this is some very interesting information when ancient man went to great lengths to convey what they saw, telling us that ancient gods had the power of flight, just like we today symbolize birds landing on the moon. We had the power of flight. So it's very possible that we just need to look a little bit harder and understand this evidence that we're getting from the ancient cultures, because over and over they talk about this glowing cross in the sky, and that these great beings, the Anunnaki, came from this planet. And again, very momentous occasions were recorded in stone of these interactions with these beings. They didn't make this stuff up, folks. If we're ever to be prepared for the next time we have an interaction with these ancient gods, we must first understand the ancient past and see the wealth of information that they've left us. We probably know exactly where Nibiru is. We just need to know exactly where to look. So there is some interesting information, again, that comes out of the Sumerian epic, because our modern sciences are starting to understand things in space in a much different view than we did, let's say, 20 years ago. So we have to start to look at some of this Sumerian evidence and realize that they're telling us information that speaks well beyond their time frame to us now with our technology. This is a Sumerian tablet that is circular in form, which in itself is interesting because they thought the shape of an ellipse or a circle was unknown to ancient man. That's why we didn't see wheeled carts and buggies being used. Well, actually, that's exactly what they were using, and they even created circular tablets. This tablet specifically had very interesting astronomical data from what they were able to interpret. This area specifically, other areas badly damaged. But when we look at this area specifically, we see that it talks about saying things along the edge that are mountain, rocket, pile up, high, 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 giving reference to the idea that this was an actual route taken by Lord Enki from their planet Nibiru, having to pass by 7 planets, or coming to the 7th planet by taking a certain route in the solar system, actually described on a Sumerian tablet. So again, we have to realize that this can't just be mythological data about Planet X, because they went to great lengths to speak about and retain the information bequeathed by the Anunnaki to the Sumerian culture about where they came from and what they believed in. There's some very interesting information recorded in many of the books by Zecharia Sitchin, like the Lost Book of Enki, that speak of specific tablets where high priests were recording information about the beliefs of Enki. One of those was, do you believe in God? Do you believe in something that is a creator of all life? And the Anunnaki's response to the Sumerian priest was, we believe in a one life force that creates everything. They call it the father of all creation. I thought that was a nice saying. But we have to understand that the Sumerian tablets, cylinder seals, pictograms, and the texts clearly paint a picture for us of a time when these Anunnaki were here on Earth. And they gave references over and over. One just has to look. Visual references, without even reading cuneiform script, of a glowing cross in the sky, of a time when the gods visited from this planet Nibiru, and over gave reference to it as a glowing cross, as a winged disc, as the ability to use the technology of this winged disc and come here to Earth. That's exactly what we see over and over. You can see the cylinder seal here is given a very interesting depiction or a description in French, unfortunately, because this is the Louvre. But the artist was nice enough to carve out what we see here as the actual little seals. A DNA symbol of a double helix, the winged disc, and then, information of other symbols that, again, are like little acronyms. CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, FYI, for your information. That's what we see in these hieroglyphic information. One symbol could mean several words. It doesn't just mean bird. It means something. It has like an acronym meaning. They were able to communicate visually in much more in-depth ways. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's exactly what we see. Over and over again, certain symbolic references that when put together, there are scenes being explained. Something to do with the winged disc, possibly Nibiru or Anunnaki, information being given, right? I unfortunately cannot translate cuneiform script, but I can look at the symbolic references over and over and see that certain ones are being displayed and discussed. Here again, winged disc. Now this time, what we also see are the 7 dots of Earth. As I showed you earlier, coming from outside of our solar system in, we're on the 7th planet. Now, modern archaeologists would look at this and say, that's the 7 sisters of Pleiades, that star system. What? No, it's representing Earth. Again, the winged disc, some type of reference of Nibiru, or this traveling ability with the Anunnaki having the ability to utilize this type of flight technology. How else could they explain flight technology without the use of showing it with wings? And that's exactly what we see over and over in great detail. A being piloting a circular craft, having the power of flight, coming from Nibiru. I mean, over and over we see these types of esoteric depictions that aren't just a man next to a flying object. They are conveying things through acronym visual references. So this is some very deep data that they, again, went to great lengths to convey to us. And over we see these same references, astronomical symbols of the planets, Saturn even being depicted with its ring. These things weren't even, able to be seen without astronomical references. So it's very interesting that we have such complete data records from a culture that's 6,000 years old. Now, this symbol again of ancient Nibiru is a cross in the sky. Here it is, Nibiru with its crescent moon. Earth, the 7 dots of Earth with our crescent moon. These things aren't hard to understand once you make the reference and the connection. So part of the information here does take an interesting turn in the fact that, while we're looking for extrasolar planets and looking into the ancient past and understanding their tracking of solar system movements, we also see in the Yucatan, on other planets, large evidence of asteroid impacts, things that could have had a gravitational or catastrophic effect in the past because of their gravitational effects. And this really does raise the question around things we need to be doing to support our current space program. This question is asked often, right? Will the ancient planet X, will Nibiru, even people claiming to see it now, that it's being hidden by the sun, or they've got pictures of it with their webcam? I don't think so. Nibiru is 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. It's a large planet, folks. We're not going to miss it. And you'll see in next week's lesson that the ability for us to track such a large object is very capable for us to do with the amount of amateur astronomers all over the Earth. Sure, there are blind spots, but we cover enough of the solar system to be seeing anything that's going to be 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for next week's lesson.